Yeah, in my essay for this issue of the journal, I started with the controversy that Lorraine laid out at the beginning tonight, where the idea of how can we school as if democracy matters in the age of the Patriot Act. And two of the things that seemed implicit in that is the idea that the Patriot Act is somehow worse or different, or that the times we live in are less democratic than the times, than other times in our history. Democracy has never generally been available for those who live in the neglected regions of capital, those who are disenfranchised by reasons of class or race and excluded from access to all of the things that we're holding self-evident in the charts that we had for this journal. So in the essay, I sort of rely a little bit on the Marxist theorist Luis Althusser and his idea of an ideological state apparatus. I think it's important to recognize that schools are institutions of the state. And so it is dubious of us, I think, to expect that institutionally schools are ever going to be the engines of real democracy or real reform. And that if we're genuinely interested in radical change that's going to bring about true democracy, we need to quit our jobs and go do something else, because this is not the place that it's going to happen. And the example, the big example in the essay that I use about schools as ideological state apparatuses is an example from my own discipline, and it's the example of the creation of the canon of English and American literatures. Literature curricula were developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and they were developed primarily to train the middle classes of the British colonial empire in places like India, and to train the working classes in places like Great Britain and the United States. Okay, and so when you set out to create the canon of English literature, you obviously have the classics of Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Milton. Everybody says, yeah, these are the guys, this is what shows the genius of literature, yak, yak, yak. When he looked for a beginning to that tradition, instead of looking back to Greece and Rome, which would be the obvious antecedents of those writers, of people like Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Milton, instead he looked back to a relatively obscure Old English text that was purely Anglo-Saxon, and that would be Beowulf. Okay? Because of the demographic changes at the end of World War II and in the 1960s, because of the GI Bill and the civil rights movement and the women's movement in the 1960s and 70s, you get an influx of people into college who have generally not been allowed there in any significant numbers before. Okay? And you suddenly have lots of people in college saying, I can't read no more of this John Milton. You are bringing me one book after another that neither looks nor sounds or acts like me at all. And you get a lot of political pressure for a different kind of canon. Okay? You get a lot of political pressure on the reasons why that canon was developed, saying, look, it's probably more than just a coincidence that in the Beowulf to Virginia Woolf canon, everybody is white and there's only 2 women. Okay, and the traditional answer of, well, we can't help it that it's fallen out that way, this is just the best, is no longer working. Okay, for those students. Those students grow up to be college professors and bring us the canon wars that we all hear about in the op-ed pages in the 1980s and 1990s. Okay? Once that canon changes, and once the principles on which that canon changes, on which the canon was made, get called into question, starting in the 80s and 90s, you can no longer count on English departments to do the job that they were invented to do, which is to produce good, little, racist, misogynist citizens. Okay? But in non-elite institutions, there has been tremendous pressure directing budgetary money away from the study of literature and away from the study of culture and toward creative writing and technical writing. Okay, a huge growth in both creative writing and technical writing. And what both of those programs do is amenable to state interests. I mean, the one produces self-involved aesthetes, the other produces employees, okay, and produces, people with skills, people who can write the labels on Viagra bottles and stuff like that. That if you are going to choose to participate in this institution, in these institutional arrangements, it seems really important for us to recognize the boundaries of that institution and understand them as genuine and real. And one of the examples I use is the example of Ward Churchill. Everybody knows what happened to Ward Churchill, that he got fired for writing the essay after 9/11 where he said all of the people in the Twin Towers were little Eichmanns. The place where Churchill probably didn't go far enough was in looking at himself and encouraging us to look at ourselves, okay? That no matter how committed we are to certain kinds of freedom, certain ideas of democracy, certain ideas of justice in the world, we are, the minute we walk in this door, also little Eichmanns. We are also participating in an institutional apparatus that is designed to keep the world divided into haves and have-nots. And rather than trying to deny that, rather than trying to ignore or suppress that, I think it's important with our students to confess to that, to admit that up front, okay, to engage it in a way that allows us to talk about it, and to talk then not just about what we're doing as individuals, but the way that the institution itself is arranged and deployed and keeps certain voices in and certain voices out. And I think that starting to show the contours of that and starting to show how race and class bound those kinds of behaviors, those kinds of rules, and those kinds of institutional arrangements is extremely important. It's a small thing, but it is a thing we can do within this institution. The second thing, and the thing that I end the essay with, and I'll end with here, is apologies to Senator Obama. The notion of perhaps encouraging our progressive students to give up the idea of hope. That becomes one of the thrusts of Henry Giroux's essay is talking about schooling for hope and a politics of hope. And I think in some ways that can be extremely destructive. That if you take a clear-eyed view of the historical arrangements of this country and you're coming to it and you're saying, I want to end racism, or I want to have justice in this country, and you look at the history of this country up till now, and you look at the arrangements that we have now, and your goal is, say, to end racism, it seems to me that the first thing you have to admit is that you're going to die a loser. Okay? Racism in this country is not going to be eradicated in my lifetime, in my children's lifetime, in my grandchildren's lifetime. Okay? And that seems to me just a banal and inevitable fact. If you give up hope, you also get to give up despair, and then you have to find a new reason to get up in the morning. Okay? Then you get up in the morning every day knowing that you're going to lose, and knowing that losing becomes an indication that you're probably doing something right. Okay? And that you have to see the dignity and honor and purpose in actually doing the work, not in the teleological notion that it will end in victory, because certainly in our lifetimes it won't. And I think that giving up hope and speaking to our students and in honest and practical ways about that kind of rhetoric is about the best that we're going to be able to do in institutional spaces like this.